Hey there guys, and welcome to yet another episode of Fan Fixes. In the background here is a whole bunch of example games when I was playtesting this deck, so you can kind of check out a visual example of some of the concepts that I will be talking about today. Fan Fixes, as you may know, is a series where people can feel free to submit to me Pauper decks at MTGOJustSin@yahoo.com. Send me them there in an email, let me know whether they are competitive or casual, and I will just take a look and give you feedback as you so desire. This week we had a submission that is basically a black and red burn deck for those who are kind of familiar with the concept. This is kind of an interesting thing. It is something that a lot of us have probably played around with at one point or another. We are often enticed by one single card in black and red, and that is Blightning. There's not a lot of big name black and red cards when it comes to, as far as gold specific, but Blightning is one card that I think everyone who plays Pauper at some point in time wants to make work. You can't underestimate a card like this that came out. It provides, direct damage as well as discard in the same kind of package, and that's something that we really all want to do. I think it is basically kind of the starting point for most people who end up trying to put together something that is black and red. I know I've done it several times. There have been a couple other Rakdos decks that have shown up as rogue in daily events and stuff like that. And I really do think that kind of the motivation behind most people when they put together a black and red deck is Blightning. And it's a great card, but at 3 cost, it is a little bit slow at points in time. So we also have kind of another black drawn in here through Bump in the Night. And I kind of wanted to talk about this card real quick as well. Now, this is a card came out in Innistrad Block, and those who are not familiar, it is a single black mana, and it does, the ability says opponent loses 3 life. Now, this is, in most people may look at this firsthand and immediately think, oh, it's a black lightning bolt. Well, that's not quite true. Now, what Lightning Bolt gains over something like Bump in the Night is the fact that Lightning Bolt can do its damage to a creature as well. Bump in the Night is appealing. It does do the 3 direct damage for the only single mana cost. That's something we look for a lot. Lightning Bolt is definitely a rarity. It's not something that Wizards has given to us on multiple occasions. Kind of that balance of 1 cost for 3 is about as powerful as they want to make a damage spell be. We have other 1 cost spells, but they don't do as much. We're all familiar with Shock, and that does 2 damage. We also, we did get Chain Lightning, which gives a lot of potential to continuously do damage if your opponent decides to recast it for that additional cost. But the odds of your opponent having that extra mana available is not going to be something you want to count on. Another thing about Chain Lightning is it is sorcery speed, so that makes it a little less powerful than Lightning Bolt. Now, Bump in the Night is great. It does do that 3 damage to your opponent, and you sit here and you can figure that, okay, well, I am a burn deck, so my initial thought is that I need to do damage to my opponent. And this is true. You are most of the time going to be looking to do direct damage to your opponent, but you do at times need to use some of your burn spells to keep creatures under control as well. That's something that Bump in the Night does lose out on. I guess one of the appeals to this over, say, something like Lava Spike, which also does 3 damage for 1, is the fact that Bump in the Night does give you a flashback cost. Now, that flashback cost, I think, is incredibly high, and I really think that Wizards did this card injustice. I think maybe this is the reason they allowed it to come in at the common level. But to be able to get a flashback for 6 and 1 for 3 damage, way too high. I think the fact that the flashback cost is a different color from the original casting cost should have been maybe enough to make this card cost a little bit less. That second color is enough to kind of hold you up and give it a drawback as far as doing damage. We've had other things that come in with that 6 flashback in like Fires of the Undeath, and that only does 2 damage, though I guess it does do damage to a creature or a player. But things like that, you just really have to weigh whether that flashback cost is worth it. Firebolt is another example. That is a basically shock spell. It does 2 damage for 1 cost, and that is a shock that gets flashback, and the return on that, it costs 4 and a colored, but that color is the same color as the original casting cost, so it makes it a little more playable. So I think that Bump in the Night is an okay choice. I really do question the Wizards' idea of making it 5 and a red. Now, that being said, those are the only black cards in this deck. So I immediately have to sit back and wonder, okay, are these two cards enough to make me want to play black, as opposed to just a straight mono red burn deck? If you're bringing in a second color, the color that you're bringing in really needs to have the strength to make it worthwhile. It really has to bring some extra benefit to this deck that makes me say, okay, I really want to play black red burn instead of mono red burn. And I don't think this is really the outcome. Sure, Blightning does give you a single card discarded, but it's the only discard spell in this deck, so I think you're doing yourself injustice by having a 3-costed 3-burn spell. With the 1 discard, sure, it's a bit disruptive, but you have to consider that your focus on this deck is burn. So you want that 3 damage. You can even go to something like Incinerate, something like that, where you're doing still 3 damage, but it's costing you less than that 3. Even better, go into the Lava Spike and get that 3 damage to target player. Really bring down your casting costs a lot more. Now, that being said, and I'm going to kind of just leave it there because you did submit it as a black-red deck, and, that's what you wanted to look at. So, that being said, I mean, just keep in mind my first big suggestion for this is you stick a little more traditional and go straight red. I understand there's some appeal to black, but I don't think it outweighs kind of the benefits. Let me try and rephrase this. I don't think bringing black in outweighs, I don't think it brings enough to the table that allows you to, bring in that extra color. I think dropping that extra color and sticking a bit more traditional is the stronger play. Now, if you want to stick with this, and that's absolutely fine, I think there are some issues with this list. First off, I feel the mana curve is a bit off. When you look at most burn decks, they want to bring in as few lands as possible, and 19 is a very minimal amount for lands, but you have things in here. You're running 4 copies of Searing Spear and 4 copies of Incinerate, and that is basically, 8 copies of Incinerate. For those who are not familiar, it's the same spell. It's okay. It does the 3 damage at instant speed. The 2 cost is not so overwhelming. Like I said, about Lightning Bolt is about as far as Wizards want to go as power level on the single cost spell to burn damage ratio. Now I think you really, if you want to run Incinerate, that's fine. Definitely I would, keep it in 3 or 4 of those. But I think running 8 is completely unnecessary. I think you can easily drop down to something that is better off for this deck. We already talked about Lava Spike, and that is 3 direct damage. It costs 1 and it does 3 to target player. You can also bring in something if you want a little more utility. You can bring in Firebolts for the flashback. It does less damage, but you do have the flashback. If you bring those in, do it at a minimum, maybe 2. You could bring in Burst Lightning, which will give you something in the late game. You can bump it up to do extra damage to your opponent and finish it off. Other options include you could go with Magma Jet if you wanted to keep kind of there. The Scry ability will give you a chance to at least siphon off a couple of those lands, move them to the bottom of your deck, and you don't have to worry about that. Like I said, 19 doesn't seem like a lot of lands, but I did run into several points in time where all of a sudden I'm getting land flooded and my opponent is down to maybe 7 life, something like that, and I just need like 2 burn spells in a row to finish him off, and I'm just drawing into lands, and that's definitely painful. Keeping the mana cost low is definitely something that's very important. I kind of like the Wild Guess. I am actually planning on writing about Wild Guess and what impact it could have on red deck wins kind of decks. I do like the card, but I may want a 3rd copy in there at the very least. Creature-wise, you're running 4 of Kiln Fiend and 3 Mog Fanatics, and I think that's great. You did mention in the message that you do think that Keldar Marauders is not as good these days because there's so many more aggro weenie decks out there, and I think that's a great assessment. I know the appeal to Keldar Marauder. You do get 2 damage off it, basically. It can actually act mostly as a blocker in those matchups. it's not what your first priority is. Your first priority, you think of it, is burn down your opponent, and that's definitely true. But in those weenie matches where you get, especially against Stompy, and they get some really small creature with a big body on the field real fast against rank or something like that, having that 3/3 might be enough to stall his attack for one turn, delay it long enough until you can do a little extra damage to him. I do like Mog Fanatics. It's definitely a little more old school, but I think it really depends on the playing environment you're in, whether or not you want to still go with those Keld Marauders or the Fanatics. I found most of the time the Fanatics I would use in situations where I was killing something off that had 4 toughness. I would use it in conjunction with something like Lightning Bolt to finish off a creature. I'm really split on it. I think it's a great card to have in an environment that is heavier on Delver. When you're running against Delver, it gives you an opportunity to quickly, you get that on turn 1, and you can quickly get rid of Delver before it flips. It gives you an opportunity to reduce fairy counts for counter spells, stuff like that. So if you're in that kind of environment, I think it definitely has some advantages. I think it has advantages against White Weenie, which has 1/1 flyers, which you can't really deal with, and it feels just horrible to use a lightning bolt to finish off a Squad Hawk. It feels like such overkill. It's ridiculous. But so if you're facing a lot of White Weenie, I would bring it in. If you're facing Delvers, I would go with it. But I actually think if you're running against other things like Stompy, if that's kind of what you're worried about, then I would throw in the Keld Marauders. I think using it as a blocker may be kind of underestimated. But having not played a lot of mono red, I could be completely wrong on that. But in my personal opinion, just looking at the lists, I think that there would be a lot of opportunities where I would want Keld Marauders as a blocker to an early, something like Young Wolf plus Ranker or something like that. So let's see what else. I mean, the rest of this is pretty traditional, with the chain lightnings and stuff like that, and I think that's very important. I do think, again, if you were able to cut down the Searing Spears to just 4 copies of Incinerate, something like that, you would allow yourself more opportunity. You could bring in 4 Lava Spikes, which is the 1 cost 3 to target player, and you would be able to reduce your mana cost down from 19. And I kind of had a bit of an issue with your mana cost here. I think it's really interesting what you did with the bounce lands plus the marshes. The marsh is great. I get the point. It's your black mana. In addition to it, it's doing damage to your opponent, and the Rakdos Canariums are going to allow you to continue to use it, and that's nice. You do now have access to the Rakdos Guildgate, and I think that would be something definitely worth testing out in a deck like this. The marshes, I think maybe if you wanted to keep that to a 2 of, that might be enough. It's really an interesting line because your black in this deck is so very low that usually your instinct is to say, well, all of your black mana sources come into play tapped, so if I want to use them, I have to wait 1 turn until I can actually use it. But because you don't actually come into so many instances where black mana comes up, it's not really something you're missing. So I still feel like maybe I would kind of reduce that strategy. It feels a little slow at times, especially if you're running into a lot of you're getting a lot of the Rakdos lands. That's going to slow you down. I did have a couple games where I had to mulligan because I had 2 or 3 lands, which is great, but if they're all those bounce lands, it means I can't actually play a land until I draw another. So that's something to keep in mind there as well. I think maybe switching those to Guild Gates would be a great start. That would give you the black mana, and I would probably reduce the marshes to a 2 or 3 copies of them. And I think you would then have the ability to continue to shrink down your mana cost, and you could bring in some other burn spells if you wanted fire bolts or, like I said, magma jets. Stagger Shock is something that's brought in a lot of the time. It's kind of nice because of the fact that you use it twice. Gives you a little utility. One of those good, not great things. Now, I do want to kind of go off on a side note here. There are a lot of kind of rack deck wins that show up time to time in the rogue versions that aren't so focused on burn. I think if you wanted to kind of stretch away from burn spells, because there isn't really much in black that offers an attractive package to a burn deck, you can look into things that focus a little more on discard. You can still get some of the haste. You can bring in the blightnings. You can get a little extra discard, maybe a couple of rats and stuff like that, and a little bit of grave recursion. And I think you can get a more solid package out of that. But now, if you want to stick to this, that's fine. I think as far as your sideboard goes, I really don't think it's awful as all. Oh god, I don't think it is awful at all. So Martyr of Ashes is a great thing to have in there. Definitely can be really good. I'm like, I hate that card because in the early game, if you have a Martyr, it's really great. Your hand is full. But usually in burn decks, if you're casting burn spell, burn spell, burn spell, you are emptying your hand really, really fast. So a mid to late game Martyr of Ashes is going to do nothing. It'll be a 1/1 body that sits there and can't really get by anything. I think it is definitely sideboard worthy. I think maybe 2 or 3 copies would be enough of that, though. Searing Blaze, definitely a good option. Terminate's a great option. Molten Rain is fine. There is maybe some artifact removal that you could bring in instead. Shattering Spree, I believe, is that? No, that's not what I'm thinking of. Smash to Smithereens is the one I'm thinking of. Is a great card that a lot of red decks, goblins and stuff like that, use to look to kill things off. If you're worried about the Storm matchup, I know you mentioned that, and I do agree that I don't think a burn deck is fast enough to deal with Storm in most cases, but there was a card that just came out in Ravnica, Return to Ravnica, the Electrickery. I think that's a great card that is going to give people an ability to deal with that pretty well. Because of the fact that it does come at instant speed. There's a lot of these 1/1 burn spells, does 1 to all creatures and stuff like that, but they don't come in at instant speed, and being able to do it at instant speed is going to give you that opportunity to kill off all those goblins, even if he has the Bushwhacker. So definitely want to look to picking up a couple Electrickeries. And that will help you kind of balance out against that matchup. Maybe if you wanted to cut down these Martyr of Ashes down to 2 of, and then bring in 2 of the Electrickeries, that would be great. Like I said, you can also consider maybe cutting down Searing Blaze to a 3 of as opposed to 4. Terminate's really a solid removal spell. The burn off Searing Blaze is great, but it's again going to work a little bit better if you're mono red. So I think that covers about all I thought about that. If you guys are looking for a quick recap, I think Mog Fanatic is a great choice, but definitely be aware of the environment you're playing in. There may definitely be times where Celd Marauder could be greater. I think the idea of using black in this deck in the first place is nice. I think it's more casual. I don't think it has more benefits to doing it than just going straight mono red. I think you can cut down Incinerate and Searing Spear down to 4 of, and that will allow you an opportunity to bring in other things that would kind of speed up your deck and reduce your mana cost. I think you definitely need to look at cutting down lands from 19 as well, and maybe look at switching up the Piranha Marsh count and replacing the Carnariums for the Guild Gates. So there you go. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it helps you out in some way or another. Again, if you guys are looking to submit your decks to the fanfics, you can send me it along at MTGOJustSin@yahoo.com. And those are Pauper only, please. I have gotten a couple of submissions that are non-Pauper, and Pauper is kind of what I do. So send those along. Feel free. Just let me know if you want casual or competitive for it. I make no promises on these becoming, DE contenders on a regular basis, but I'm more than happy to at least give my insight on suggestions and whatnot for the decks themselves. So there you go. Hope you guys enjoy it, and definitely, like I said, send them along because we are going to have a bit of a gap in our YouTube content. So there you go. Enjoy it. Have a nice day, guys.